Hello and welcome to this session of a Rome Med panel. I remind you all and thank you for joining us today. Rome Med is our flagship initiative here at ISPI, bringing us to the conference in December. And so today we're here to talk about energy transitions in times of war, a perspective from the MENA region. Joining me today are four wonderful panelists: Aisha Al-Sari from the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and research fellow at the National University of Singapore's Middle East Institute. Thank you for joining us. Rim Berhab, senior economist at the Policy Center for the New South. Dana Kupova, head of green economic transition and financial institutions at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And finally, Anna Rovzar, head of international partnerships at the Rest for Africa Foundation. So again, thanks for joining us today. Let me give you a brief introduction of what we're going to talk about today. I guess you all know where we are at in Europe and from the European view. Right now on the energy markets here in Europe, we have our Brent price at around $109 per barrel, which is close to the maximums that we've seen over the past 20 years. And we have our European gas market at the spot price, which is nearing 110 euros per megawatt hour, which is one of the highest in the past months, and it's actually the highest ever we've reached. So high energy prices in Europe, clearly linked to the war in Ukraine, not necessarily linked just to that, but leading us to these times of, let's say, energy scarcity in Europe. And you know, a lot of things going on in the world. This energy price, at least for the oil market, is for the whole world. So all world is experiencing energy scarcity. But these high oil prices are also, in some ways, a boon for some countries that are oil exporters. So today we are actually looking at the transition and how this impacts on whether, you know, the energy exporters in the MENA region are willing or able to do enough in their own transition, given right now the context of high oil prices, and whether those who are actually energy importers, so like Europe, have a hard time at these times, not just of energy, but also of commodity markets, high prices, trying to deal with that and with transition as well. So let me just lead forward to the first panelist and field her a question, which is, on all our minds, which is how are the Gulf countries doing? So Aisha Al-Sari from the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. My question to you is, how are Gulf countries doing in these times of higher prices? And what do you think, what do you expect, how do you expect the transition that they actually committed to do to go and to let's say develop over the next few years? Aisha.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew, and thanks for having me in this panel today. Amid the Russia-Ukraine crisis at the moment for the Gulf Arab states, if you look at the implications of the crisis on the energy transition in the region, we can think about it from two perspectives, from a short-term perspective and a long-term perspective. Now, in terms of the short-term perspective, the GCC or the EU is in a position to, put a pressure on Russia to end the war on Ukraine. And with that, it aims to phase out the dependence on the Russian gas by 2/3 by the end of 2022, and to be independent from Russia well before 2030. This proposal came last March. So EU is in a position to find a quick fix, and quick fix evidently doesn't happen through the renewables at the moment. So EU is looking to diversify its supply of the energy sources. And with that, the quick fix would come through oil, gas, and coal to meet the current needs of the EU countries. So in this case, and as we have seen evidently from the pressure from Western governments like the US and the UK, and through the business and the call to, for example, the de facto rulers of the OPEC to, release more of the oil into the market. But this is not happening through OPEC because OPEC wants or insists to stick to the production quota. But what we see that, for example, Qatar is having negotiations with the EU countries like the Germany. It already has signed an agreement with Germany to export gas, the LNG. We also have seen negotiations, for example, between Oman and France also to export gas as well. So if we look at the implication in the short term, it might look like that would delay the energy transition in the GCC itself. However, I don't think this is necessarily true if we think about it from long-term perspective, because EU itself, it has the EU Green Deal, and it also amid the crisis, it put forward this proposal to be independent from Russia, and that also the EU wants to meet its carbon neutrality by 2050. And that wouldn't happen through, just continue depending on the oil, gas, and coal. So I think this is a time where the EU countries can negotiate with the oil producing, like the GCC countries, to, provide the fuel, which is in a way more cleaner. And I think the hydrogen is playing a major role at the moment. And it's already happening. It happens in, in bilateral negotiations between the GCC countries and the EU countries, for example, between Oman and Germany. And so the EU countries are asking the oil producing countries to provide, for example, in the long term, to provide them with hydrogen, for example. So in the long term, I think this crisis is actually pushing for the acceleration of the energy transition.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's an important point, the fact that we have different forces at work, and it's interesting your take that it actually accelerating rather than slowing down the energy transitions. Let me switch to an energy important, so the view of an energy important, net in energy important country, and actually a country, Morocco, that is very close to Europe, very integrated with the European energy markets right now already, at least in the electricity sector, and somehow also in the natural gas sector. So how is the view from Rim Berhab, senior economist at the Policy Center for the New South? Rim, what do you expect there to happen? How do you see the energy transition in Morocco going? How do you expect the Ukraine crisis to impact on that?
Thank you very much, Matteo, for your kind introduction. First of all, I'm thrilled to participate in this panel, and I would like to thank, first of all, ISPI for their invitation. So these are very complex questions, so for the sake of time, I will dive right in and perhaps start with a brief talk about current status of energy transition in Morocco. So as you know, Morocco has adopted a forward-looking energy transition back in 2009, which is still the current framework for action now. And this strategy represented a breakthrough from previous policies in that it set out an ambition for leadership in the field of renewable energy. And this was the proof for Morocco, because what the country lacks in oil and gas, it makes up for in important renewable resources, which are proving to be economically viable thanks to technological evolution and falling costs. At the same time, Morocco worked to provide an appropriate legal and regulatory framework to support renewable energy deployment in the power sector, particularly, with various laws to support self-generation and to initiate market liberalization for renewable production. These efforts have resulted in significant achievements in the power sector. So the share of renewable energy, excluding hydro, in electricity generation has increased significantly from virtually 0% in 2000 to around 15% in 2020. And if we include hydro, this share further increases to 20% during that same year. Beside renewable energy, Morocco considers gas as a non-negotiable pillar in its energy strategy, even though it accounts for a small share in its energy mix. So in this sense, it has adopted a national roadmap for the development of natural gas for the 2021-2050 period, and sees gas as a lever for the competitiveness of its industry and urbanization economy to medium term. Beside the power sector, Morocco has also made significant effort to phase out subsidies for fossil fuels since 2013 in order to free up fiscal space so investment could be redirected to renewable energy sources. Yet subsidies for liquefied petroleum gas or butane remains for social reasons in order to avoid a disproportionate burden on poor population. But as a result of all these efforts, Morocco's energy dependence rate has seen important improvements as it has decreased by around 8 percentage points between 2002 and 2020, although it still remains high. So these achievements have made Morocco among the leaders of energy transition in Africa, but there are of course several challenges that need to be addressed in order to accelerate further this transition and go beyond the energy sector, the power sector. Sorry, and I'd be glad to go over these during the discussion. Now for your second question, I'd like to divide it into two subsections and start by Europe's ambitions to shift to a low carbon economy. So Europe's decarbonization efforts really peaked with the adoption of the EU Green Deal back in 2019. So several overlapping interests between Morocco and the EU have emerged, creating new potential areas for cooperation. But there are also some divergent priorities, but I won't expand on that now. So these common interests include the development of renewable energy, the improvement of energy efficiency, but also green hydrogen potential. Finally, we cannot ignore the current global context that was marked first by a global pandemic, as well as by the current war in Europe, which has put global energy market in turmoil. And this brings me to the last part of the question. So given the interdependencies of the global markets, Morocco will certainly be affected by the Ukraine-Russia war, but not to the extent of Europe. Still, it will be hit by the double surge in energy and food prices, which risks exacerbating its external imbalances and concerns about persistent inflation. So while it is true that this disruption might make us doubts about the energy transition in the immediate term, as Aisha brilliantly presented, I think that especially since Europe is now seeking mainly oil and gas to lessen its dependence vis-à-vis Russia, but I don't think that this will derail the energy transition on the long term. Quite the contrary, it only encourages Morocco to reduce its dependence on fossil fuels, which are subject to high volatility, and to capitalize on its renewable energy expertise. So in this sense, opportunities have arisen with Europe in the past years, but are still prevalent now. And while Europe is currently looking to alternative oil and gas supplies in order to, as I said, reduce its dependence vis-à-vis Russia, it would benefit from seeking partners in the renewable energy field in order to diversify its mix and avoid being reliant on one supplier, therefore perpetuating the same dependency scenario with Russia. So really now I think the challenge that must be met is to balance between short-term energy security concerns with the long-term energy transition.
Thank you so much, Reem. Yes, that's the goal for each one of us within the financial constraints that you just underlined. So high energy prices and food prices are double hitting our economies. So the challenge now is not to slow down too much, at least, the energy transition during this phase in which we are scrambling for solutions. Hopefully, these solutions also come from the green energy sector and actually some acceleration in the transition. It's good to see Morocco is at the forefront of this, and so I guess it will remain in the future in North Africa. So thanks a lot. Let me switch to an international institution that is actually at the forefront of the transition, so the EBRD. So Dana Kupova, from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. You see this from the outside looking in, but also, on practical projects on the ground. So my question to you is, how is the EBRD helping countries fostering the transition? Do you have some examples? And also maybe how do you assess the current challenges and whether financial institutions can help, let's say, countries at a very difficult time right now, continuing along the transition, or at least not falling back too much? The floor.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Matteo, and thank you for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and great to hear from my fellow panelists with regards to the challenges that they see from their perspective. I guess not everybody on the line is familiar with the EBRD, so let me just introduce briefly the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We are a regional multilateral development bank. We are owned by 71 countries. We are actively working across 36 economies, spanning from North Africa to Central Eastern Europe, Western Balkans, Turkey, Central Asia, Caucasus. So we cover really a broad range of countries. And I really liked what my previous fellow panelists mentioned about not losing the focus of the long-term ambition for low carbon transition, because while we are now at a very difficult point, of course, we need to keep focusing on achieving the major green transition goals. Your question, Matteo, was more about the energy transition, but I really want to say that for our institution, it's more about the overall greening of the economies. So we cannot really isolate just the sort of transformation of the energy sector from addressing the demand side, but also addressing the climate resilience needs of the countries and even environmental challenges. And this is all part of of EBRD's greening model that we pursue. As many of you know, EBRD has set itself quite an ambitious goal of becoming majority green bank by 2025. So this shows you the commitment that we have as an institution to help our economies and help our counterparties across the region with the transition. In the end of the day, the EBRD is quite known for its infrastructure investments in the energy sector. So large projects, including across North Africa. But Matteo, you were asking about some significant examples that I could flag. And today I would like to focus my intervention on the work that we do with financial institutions across the region. Because if you look at what EBRD does overall, we provide about 10 billion of financing of annual basis. But ultimately, if we look at our financial institutions across the region, they have about 3.5 trillion of assets under management. So by working through local partner financial institution, we can really achieve a substantial impact in the countries and help with the low carbon transition. Now, the most notable model that we have in the financial sector is called Green Economy Financing Facilities. And this model is supposed to address all the key issues or the key barriers that the sectors, that is sort of blocking the sector from making more investments into green energy efficiency, renewable energy projects, larger scale, but mainly the distributed energy as well. So we have developed a model where we extend financing to our partner local financial institutions for a specific purpose, notably for green financing. But we also provide, alongside the financing, all the tools that the financial institutions need to make these investments. So we provide technical assistance to help some borrowers to assess projects, identify technologies. We provide tools for easy assessment of smaller scale projects. And in some cases, we also provide some concessional elements jointly with our donor partners to address the affordability constraints. And this model has proven itself very successful across the region. And, Matteo, you asked about how we measure impact and how we measure success. As an institution, we like to think of ourselves as a leader in green financing, but you can't be a leader unless others follow. So we measure our success and impact in this space by how much the local financial institutions are able to scale up their own financing, because that is the ultimate objective. We need to transform the financial systems so that the banks, local banks, are able to make informed investments with all the right ENS safeguards and financial evaluations to support the scaling up of renewable energy and energy efficiency in the region. So I hope I didn't overrun too much. But back over to you, Matteo.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this interaction. I'll be back to you as with all other panelists briefly. Just to mention one figure that and put it into context that you mentioned. You mentioned $1.5 trillion in assets. And that's interesting, just for reference to our audience, that's almost the same as Italy's GDP. So, I mean, you can make a difference clearly, especially for sectors that require financing and, as you said, guarantees and so on, in order to become sustainable at scale. So that's absolutely important, and that's important work that you do. So thanks a lot. I'll be back to you. Let me switch to another, let's say, outsider looking in from countries, which is Anna Rovzar from the Rest for Africa Foundation. And my question to you is, again, I'm going back to square one. How do you see the energy transition going, especially in North Africa? If you want, you can expand over the region, the MENA region. And then how did the Ukraine war maybe impact on the sector? Anyway, where do you see this going? And are you confident, optimistic, to see any reasons for concern?
Thank you, Matt, a lot for being here. I'm going to join in expressing, and it's a real pleasure to have this discussion. I think your question observes back a look at today and maybe a look forward. If we consider the energy transition and how it has been taking place in the past few years, let's say, it's actually been, depending on many views, but let's say we can say it has been well underway in North Africa. In recent years, we've seen a lot of ambition from countries scaling up. We've seen a lot of positive developments. I mean, I don't need to spell out again how, as Rim has done really well, what Morocco has done. It's become an actual leader in the region and in the continent, especially. Egypt is such another country that has actually gone from energy shortages back in 2015 to surpluses, basing this on a diversified energy strategy and really trying to also make a lot of headway in renewables. There's the largest renewable energy plants in Africa are actually in those two countries. Tunisia is another country that has made a lot of effort in the energy efficiency space. I mean, so there's quite a few success stories there, too many to count right now. So that's actually been going forward, in fact, to scale up, but it's actually really been going forward. If we look at today, I mean, this is unprecedented times. I mean, we actually have a crisis on top of a crisis. We came out of a pandemic. Now we are in another type of security aspect and crisis that we haven't seen in a very long time. This is having spillover effects as far as the globe can reach. Let's say mostly in Europe, of course, as my colleagues already mentioned really well, but it's too early to tell on macro effects, but we know that we're seeing let's say growth that is being impacted in many regions across the world. North Africa seems to still be resisting this quite well, but this is different. There's regional differences there. Of course, inflation is expected to rise a lot further. This puts further stress on commodities, on food prices, which is of course an area of concern, especially given that many of our countries, of the countries we're looking at, are food importers, and that has a direct connection with the war in Ukraine. There's this legacy of COVID and debt crisis that, of course, we still have, and we're seeing that many countries, this is limiting the space for maneuver, if you will. Where we do see an element is, let's say, oil exporter countries seem to have some windfall profits there that can fall in, and this is interesting because because it gives us a little bit of an essence, an indication of also how this energy transition can go. The impact on the energy transition, like Aisha said really well, we need to look at this from the short to the midterm to the long-term element here. It's very important that we keep the focus, like Dana said, on this energy transition. It needs to really stay put. And one way of doing that is to make sure that countries maintain that focus by distinguishing their domestic consumption from what oil producers, let's say, can work on in terms of export. So if we can, let's say, use this the windfall profits to sort of bring the sector in those countries into transition logic, sort of break with the past, where before, when there was a low incentive but a high oil prices were high, there was a low incentive to change. But now, if we could break from that and sort of use those revenues to bring the sector further into transition, in other words, to make sure that domestic consumption is freed up from gas, is freed up from oil, and used towards renewables, let's say, and then that gas, for example, can be used for export purposes where there is difficulty to now find immediate volumes in that sense, as everyone is trying to diversify a bit away now. This, I think, can have a lot of indications in the short term and the midterm, especially following on the long term, where we clearly have signals of Europe, let's say, that really wants to diversify away. So the signaling is kind of key here. I think that we're all sort of trying to understand where we're at. We all talk about net zero, let's say only a year ago, but also talking about increasing supplies and security. So there is a bit of a sense of contradiction, but there is a way to bring those two together if we just kind of harmonize that towards the long term. And in that sense, I think it's actually absolutely possible to keep the transition, not derail it, to actually bring it together, keep this vision and make sure that as we're trying to figure out the market dynamics, as we deal with this extra uncertainty from these crises, that we do try to keep that focus on making sure domestic electricity, let's say, where it is possible in countries in North Africa, can come from these renewables, and making sure that we kind of keep the volumes in that way kind of afloat. And I mean, we do see many of these signs also on the energy transition continuing. We're in the year of COP27, will take place in Egypt once again. We see a lot of signs here in terms of green hydrogen production for industrial purposes. Of course, we're seeing a lot of increase in renewables, and there is a sort of sense that this is being expanded and still being set course in that direction. And I mean, it is our hope, especially as West for Africa Foundation, that this continues. We see a clear role for that. It is going to be a diversified story, of course, but renewables are absolutely part of the answer. So back to you here, Matteo.
Thank you, Anna. Absolutely, and it's so interesting that you point out to the, let's say, contradictions, but also the opportunity to move forward as time, slowly, but inevitably it comes to run out. So it's no more the time in which you can really postpone anything. And it's interesting because now, with your comments on the, let's say, this year's COP27, so the Conference of Parties of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, this year will be hosted by Egypt. So let me turn to Aisha again and ask her a question, which is, again, highlighting maybe the contradictions, the challenges and the opportunities. So last year we held the COP26 in Glasgow. Now we have COP27 in Egypt, and next year it will be hosted by the United Arab Emirates. So a large energy producer and exporter, and obviously many questions come out, as large energy producers and exporters hosting conferences on climate change. How is this going to pan out? Are there going to be challenges, or maybe just fears? Or is there really an opportunity to bring on board countries that are already maybe doing something and maybe much along the energy transition, and might even be pushed to accelerate given the fact that they will be under the international spotlight? What's your take?
Well, thank you again for a very good question. My take and a short answer to your question, I think for the Egypt and the UAE to host the upcoming 2 COPs, we would see more acceleration of the climate action, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation across the MENA region, as well as in the GCC. And it's actually already happening. It is happening at the government level, at the companies level, and also at the level of financial institutions. To give an example, for example, now, like especially after COP that has been COP26 that has been held in Glasgow, where the Paris rule book has been adopted and the global stocktake has been agreed on. Now countries or the governments are under pressure to assess their progress in achieving the objectives set in their nationally determined contributions. So although like maybe there's not enough media coverage, but the governments in the background are actually in a process on working on, collecting the necessary information, as well as assessing their progress in achieving their NDCs, for those informations to be submitted later on to the UNFCCC. And also, this is not only specific to the governments, but also if you come to the GCC region, we also see the national oil companies across the region are taking part also to be part of the global energy transition. This is partly because they want to contribute to achieving the objectives of the Paris Agreement, but they are also under a pressure not to be left behind. So if you look at different national oil companies, including Aramco, for example, ADNOC in Abu Dhabi and the BDO in Oman, these companies are actually taking initiatives and are in a process to look for how to diversify their portfolio and also to develop a new business model where renewable energy, the hydrogen and other cleaner energy sources could be part of their business model. And also, I think it is not only the pressure that the GCC and the MENA countries would have because of, like kind of the enforcement of the Paris Agreement that we have now, but also I think for the MENA region especially, it is one of the most vulnerable regions to the impacts of the climate change. For example, it poses almost only 1% of the fresh water. And it's one of the most stressed water stressed region in the world. So I think the MENA region also is in a position where it can take the host of the COP27 and COP28, to address the impacts of the climate change, especially in terms of the adaptation. And I think here I would say, like, perhaps the emphasis that we would see in the COP27, where the Egypt will be the host, will be a little bit different from the emphasis on the agenda and the priorities when the UAE hosting the COP28. So I think for Egypt, which will be more likely to represent the African continent, the focus will be more on the adaptation finance, and the loss and damage. But if we focus on the UAE and the COP28, I think we'd see more of a highlight on the how to protect the hydrocarbons in a way that we can still keep the hydrocarbon energy systems, but how to enable the hydrocarbon system to be more of cleaner than the traditional one, and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to a minimum. So from my perspective, the UAE host of the COP28, we will see more of a discussion on the carbon markets, the impact of response measures, as well as also the loss and the damage for the GCC, because also the GCC are vulnerable to extreme weather events. And so yes, so and the last point I would also say, for any countries that host the COPs, there would be kind of a pressure, like we want to do, or we want to present our case as a good case. So I don't think like there would be, a lag in terms of addressing the issues of the climate change. And it's already happening. We are seeing more progress on developing renewable energy, the hydrogen, the carbon capture and storage, and more recent examples in terms of the carbon markets. it is interestingly that we have now a carbon credit exchange platforms established by Abu Dhabi and also the PIF, the Public Investment Fund of the Saudi Arabia. So the momentum is the energy transition and the addressing the climate change is gaining momentum already in the region.
Thank you, Aisha. And so let's hope that the COP28 is really a moment to take stock of that and maybe build on top of it. Let me turn to Reem again with difficult questions. We are now in the part of the section in which I can delve deeper. And clearly, you're from the Policy Center for the New South, so I guess you could expect from Morocco this question from looking outside from Europe to the region. So what is happening? Is energy also going back to being an instrument of foreign policy there, given the fact that maybe some of our within our audience don't know that, but a few months ago, Algeria stopped the flow of gas to Morocco through the Maghreb-Europe pipeline, which also serves Spain, but actually also serves Morocco, in a diplomatic crisis that is still ongoing. So what is your take on that? Is this maybe, not just in the politics terms, but also in the energy markets terms, is this going to push Morocco towards the energy transition more? Or as you said earlier, given that natural gas is strategic, is still strategic for you, is this going to be a liability problem? And how do you plan to, how does Morocco plan to assess and deal with it over these years?
Thank you, Matteo, for your question. First of all, I would like to express how happy I am to hear the perspectives of my fellow speakers, and before tackling this very sensitive issue, I want to point out that it is true that the energy transition and the fight against climate change is not only becoming one of Morocco's top national priorities, but also a staple of its foreign policy. As I said, Morocco has built an expertise in developing renewable energy and is currently allocating significant resources to research and development. Also, given its vulnerability to climate change and particularly to water scarcity, Morocco is also very committed to address these climate risks. So it has updated its NDCs in 2021 with more ambitious targets and is undertaking numerous adaptation efforts. Such example lies in the water pumping and desalination fields. So recently, Morocco has launched a national solar pumping program that aims to reduce the use of fossil fuels, namely butane in agriculture, in order to save water and energy and improve the output and productivity of farmers. So I believe that Morocco aims now to become one of the global players in the energy transition by both capitalizing on its experience to form sustainable partnerships while at the same time addressing the remaining barriers to the energy transition. So I have mentioned the numerous overlapping interests with Europe, and these interests, of course, represent important venues of future cooperation. And in this sense, the EU and Morocco have recently committed to work towards establishing a green partnership that prioritizes cooperation on energy, combating global warming, protecting the environment, and promoting the green economy. And this goes back to what Dana mentioned before. It's not only about the transition of the energy sector, but more so embarking in a green economy and focusing on a sustainable green economy. But besides Europe, Morocco is also seeking to do partnerships with other countries or other regions, namely in Africa, given the proximity. But now for your second part of the question. Personally, I don't think that the halt in the flow of the Maghreb-Europe pipeline will hamper energy transition in Morocco. Quite the contrary, this is an additional incentive for Morocco to invest more in energy, which is a country proven to be cost competitive, and at the same time diversify energy suppliers. So even though gas is still a staple in Morocco's energy strategy, Morocco's share of gas in its current mix is not very high. So this is why it is able to find other suppliers quickly. So recently, the Moroccan Minister of the Energy Transition announced that Morocco will enter the liquefied natural gas market last month. So Morocco is already preparing 4 ports to receive liquefied gas, mainly coming from the US. And at the same time, transport, regasification, and storage facilities are also being built. So while these infrastructures are being constructed, existing infrastructure in Europe could be used. So this is why in recent months, Morocco has held several discussions with Spain in order to use both its liquefied gas terminals and regasification units to ensure its energy security. So Spain has recently agreed to Morocco's request, which will allow it to buy liquefied gas on international markets and load it in regasification plants on Spanish mainland and import it via the Maghreb Europe pipeline. But of course, this comes at an additional cost, as importing liquefied gas is much more expensive than importing it in its gas state. Meanwhile, Morocco has also embarked in a big regional project, which is the Morocco-Nigeria gas pipeline. So the idea of this project has emerged in 2016, and today the feasibility studies have been completed, and Nigeria, through the National Nigerian Petroleum Corporation, has indicated its willingness to begin construction from the West African pipeline extension. So with the total cost of around $25 billion, this project that will cross several African countries has received the support of ECOWAS. But as big infrastructure projects goes, they are usually faced with many challenges, especially when they involve numerous partners and numerous countries, and they more than often take long time in order to be completed. So I don't see these projects materializing in the short term. So back to you.
Thank you so much, Remy. So, some challenges, yes, especially for infrastructure. I guess that, especially, using existing infrastructure from Spain, even though it's politically risky, but it's one of the options that's still there, given also the high liquefaction capacity, regasification capacity in Spain that is still unused today. So it's very interesting to hear. And also it's very interesting to hear an elaboration on other projects that have been in the process of discussion for many years. And also the fact that you expect this to also push Morocco towards, at least pushing it towards the transition in the midterm. So back to Dana, and we discussed the financing of huge projects. You underlined the fact that these days it's very important to look at small scale, sometimes off-grid projects and so on. But again, back to the role of international institutions, the EBRD and so on. What do you see on the ground? How do you see the process going? How do you avoid, how do you foster the investment on the ground? You already said something along these lines, but if you can elaborate further. And also, how do you avoid that, some duplications with others that invest in the same field in many countries? And maybe also, how do you see, the future of the region going? Do you expect, are you planning to step up investment in this field over the next few years?
Okay, thank you very much, Matteo. So maybe taking this step by step, and how we foster the investments on the ground. So what I mentioned in my previous question was the combination of tools that we use to help some borrowers, to basically help financial institutions and the project implementers to put projects in place, assess them from financial and technical perspective. So we have a number of instruments that can really help with projects on the ground. But I think that what you were hinting at in your question is on how we foster partnership, cooperate, and how we make sure that the system moves overall and that there is no duplication. So let me reiterate that when we started with the the energy transition investments into renewable energy projects, for example, we very much focused on our partnerships with other donors, for example, with bilateral but also multilateral donors such as Green Climate Fund, who can provide a little projects
We are.
which are faced.
We have been losing you for a moment here.
Constraints
Okay.
to support.
Be back right now, but we lost the past few seconds. Try again. Dana? No, we cannot hear you anymore. So maybe we can solve this and be back in a few minutes. Sorry, Dana, we will try to solve this. So let me switch to Aina for a second. We were talking about how to finance the transition, but my question to you is, how do you see this from Rest for Africa Foundation, from your point of view? How can we foster, first, dialogue between the governments in the region, maybe between private partners and the governments in the region, maybe also what's your take from your view and from your organization, and what do you see, as being maybe the main risks in mobilizing capital in the region, but also maybe the main opportunities that you've seen in your experience over the past few years, something that you can point to and say, okay, that's the way we should go.
Thanks, Matteo, and I really hope that Dana can come back, because I think that she was going to make a very in that direction. URD is also a very important facilitator and player in that landscape, let's say. I mean, of course, a private sector is private sector, and the investment that goes with that is an actual materialization of what we're trying to do here, right? So the energy transition will take place and will be materialized when we see projects on the ground, when we see an aggregated effect, when we see megawatts and we see real projects sort of delivering that transition that we are talking about here. In the renewable energy space, there is interest to invest in areas in the areas where the best resources are, in the areas where projects can actually take place, and where there is a demand for this energy. And when we look at, Rest for Africa Foundation looks at Africa as a continent. We started off looking at the Mediterranean, North Africa, so we have a very fond focus on these countries. But when we look further south, of course, this is a continent in full expansion sense of the word, and energy is an absolute prerequisite for any economy to underbuild itself. So this is why we always keep about how transformative such a transition can be from many perspectives. And private sector delivers this. Private sector delivers this and needs to therefore see a few elements in place that will draw not just its attention, because that's already there, absolutely, but also very much the projects that can go up and deliver the difference. And so there's a few, you speak of barriers, there's a few elements can help being facilitated, and why this dialogue is actually so important from the public. But to focused here, really the aspect of clarity on where a country wants to go. And in times of uncertainty like today, that is a difficult feat. This is very understandable. So, but that's why it's so also encouraging, let's say, to hear during this roundtable how much we're committed towards this energy transition, and how much that really is the pathway forward, whether it's short-term, mid-term, or long-term. Now, how to get there is, of course, the real piece of the puzzle. But let's say if we can understand real clarity from countries that this is what they want to achieve, how they want to get there, how they see that playing out in terms of the actual building blocks that private sector needs to go there. So the regulatory and the policy frameworks, the legal aspects, the market incentives, this is really sort of key. And so countries, set their strategy about what their response is going to be, and that is absolutely necessary in that sense. Whether it's for any set in the renewable energy space, this is very much so. And again, the beautiful part of this is there's been multiple success stories in this very sector, in this very continent, that prove it's possible. There's a multiple identify and that really show that a business case is possible. It's no longer an aspect of 10 years ago, thing perhaps. This is definitely part of the story, but it is part not, but it's the business case is very much where we see some hesitation apart from the policy regulatory frameworks, but it's very much linked, is of course a high risk perception, but this is also evolving very much, and this is where the international cooperation is very key, is very important. as Rest for Africa Foundation, we do this, we try to get this dialogue, this public-private dialogue very much on the rails to make sure that we can cover the gaps where possible. So one of the main points that we always look towards is that capital can sometimes be way more expensive in certain countries. Now I'm looking more towards Sub-Saharan Africa, up to 7 times more expensive sometimes, which is very important for renewables because of course renewables are in essence a capital intensive, a capex intensive exercise. So that plays a big role. And there's a role for actors within this international space that is trying to push for this energy transition to compensate, to come in, to de-risk, to provide guarantees, to sort of find a middle way. And I think that there is a tipping point at some stage that can help really create a sort of aggregator effect, and that this risk will come down in that sense. But this is just a few 2 points: regulatory frameworks and this risk aspect of financing that are barriers in that sense. It points towards the utility scale of projects. Now we look at the energy access field, which is much broader, of course, and is also different when it comes to specific countries in North Africa versus Sub-Saharan Africa. This is related to electrification rates, of course, but we find that there is an entire different field also that's very much of interest beyond the electricity only field, which is that of productive uses, which can come into a wider green economy field or aspect that Dana was talking about earlier, and that has significant potential in the North African region, in the MENA region as well. But perhaps that's for subsequent questions. So I'll stop here, Matteo.
Let's try maybe now to go back to Dana, because as you said, especially regulatory clarity, the intention, let's say political intention, must be set clear, and the business case can be built, as you said. So let me go back to Dana, who is also building business cases day by day. So back to you, if you can stay within 2 minutes, so then I can also make some questions to the other panelists.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Matteo. Absolutely. I actually wanted to just flag one more thing that maybe was not covered in the response by my co-panelists, and that is the fact that we might get some unusual allies in the fight for low carbon transition and more renewable energy and alternative energy sources. And it links to the whole transformation of the financial sector, which is currently ongoing. Transparency, but with transparency comes accountability, and with accountability will come action. And the banks will need to look into their portfolio, what they are financing, and think, okay, if I want to continue finance certain sectors, I either need to improve my the due diligence approaches for these projects, or I refocus my strategy and I do more in renewable energy where it will be in the future.
Thank you, Dana. Really, thank you for the clarity and for the brevity. And clearly, it's interesting, the unusual allies. Let me just now field one question each. The other 3 panelists, and if I can, I ask you to answer really briefly in 1 minute. It's just, our closing time. So let me start with Rim in order of what I see as, being a logical link to questions. One was around, new infrastructures and dialogue, because you mentioned new infrastructures, especially in the gas field, but maybe, again, from Morocco, it might be interesting to see also, this kind of infrastructure in electricity, especially, right? Given that Morocco is the only country in Africa being linked with the energy market, electricity market in Europe, and it's been for many years. So the question might be, do you see anything going forward there, and do you see opportunities for Northern Africa to be linked to Europe?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matteo. you.